Hello and welcome back to Eaton's Technology Summit for Data Centers and Energy, coming to you from Madrid. I'm Emma Strutton, I'm Head of Channels at DCD, and a pleasure to be joined by Steph Veigel, who is the VP for Global Partnerships and Alliances at Eaton. So thanks very much for joining me today, Steph. How are you?
Thanks for having me. Very good.
Perfect. So I suppose just to start us off, are you able to tell me a little bit more about you, kind of your career journey so far and your role at Eaton?
Sure. I sort of oversee and support the global partnerships and alliances for Eaton, primarily specializing in data centers. It's a very focal topic for the organization right now, and so we're putting a lot of effort into that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, when it comes to partnerships, how are data centers moving from power consumers to active grid participants?
It's a very exciting topic right now. And it's getting a lot of attention, both in the media as we as individuals are starting to use more and more compute in our daily lives. So this is actually something that's very near and dear to us at Eaton. What's really happening there is data centers are really about becoming grid consumers rather than just being power consumers. They're really actively having to manage the process of, being a grid asset eventually. And so helping them through that transitionary process to help those data centers not only become a grid asset, but support the grid, but in doing so in a way that is also it helps the grid gain additional flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to the grid challenges that we're seeing at the moment in many regions of the world, how is this supporting the global energy transition as well?
Well, the energy transition is largely about how you produce and how you consume from less carbon intensive type fuels. And what's instrumental in that is data centers are having to look at not only how do they secure power, but also how do they manage that grid connectivity? How do they support sustainability? How do they support the various transition to different types of load managements that they can be considered more of an asset rather than a liability in the transition process. So a lot of times people look upon data centers as just being a drain on the grid. It's really about how do they become a support to the grid, not so much a liability.
Yeah, absolutely. And what have you seen in terms of when it comes to on-site strategy? What have you seen in terms of alternative and bridging fuels that have supported that kind of over the last year?
This is also in a state of flux. One of the, first and foremost at the top of the list right now is going to be those hybrid gas to battery type solutions. Those are going to offer the most in terms of being able to address the near-term viabilities of meeting the needs at scale. For data centers, it's all about scale. When you're hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts in scale, you're going to need those type of alternative fuels that are available at scale to produce those type of power. So things like biomethane, things of that nature are going to be on the much smaller scale size of the equation. So hybrid gas to batteries type solutions are right there. I'd say next underneath that would be hydrogen ready technologies when the infrastructure is available in the future. But having that flexibility is going to be paramount as we think about alternative fuels for data center side, on the data center side.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And you mentioned batteries there, which are of course critical to on-site generation. So how do you think the role of battery energy storage systems is evolving to support on-site power generation and grid interactivity, particularly when it comes to renewables?
Well, that's getting right to the core of the issue. Really, batteries are all about energy orchestration. They support the process for data centers on, how to bridge the load production or the power generation perspective, but then how do you match the load of the data centers with the power production? They often become that intermediary in that orchestrating from a load management, load following perspective. And that's critical at the end of the day. Not only do they support that from a behind the meter perspective, but they also become, as I mentioned earlier, as data centers become grid assets at the end of the day, they're all about, how do you provide ancillary services back into the grid, peak shaving, load following, things of that nature, in terms of how do they smooth out renewables? So if you had renewables at your data center or as part of your long-term PPA strategy with the grid, how do they smooth that out, and how do they then provide power back into the grid when the grid needs it the most? So it's really about becoming that asset, not the liability.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess to finish this off, how do you see grid interactive strategies and partnerships developing over the next year?
It's over the next year. It's really about behind the meter power generation is ultimately going to be front and center to meeting the needs of data centers, both in the U.S. as well as in Europe. That's going to be critical. And helping to support that process to become that asset to the grid, because it offers the best solution for a lot of the regulatory frameworks to best meet that need. Because building out the grid is going to take years and years and years in that process, but you can actually do a lot of the behind the meter type power generation in a way in which that is supportive of the grid, but is also being done at a much quicker pace. And we have a partnership with Siemens Energy that helps to support that initiative. And that's really going to be about behind the meter. The next, I think, is really going to be really focusing on the regulatory framework associated with how do we think about data centers, where do they fit in the space of the grid, and then how do we then accelerate the grid transformation in a world where we're getting exponential demand of compute growth, which is key to our daily lives. So it's really about, it's going to be about how do data centers become more of the production side of their own power needs, but also at the same time being flexible in how they produce and provide back to the grid.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Steph, it's great to speak to you. Unfortunately, I have to wrap it up there, but thank you so much for joining me. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.